"I'm too big for you," the Amish mail-order bride said. But the Virgin Mountain man looked her straight in the eye and whispered, "You're perfect." The stagecoach dust hasn't even settled before the whole town bursts into laughter. A widow cast out in shame, a giant woodsman too shy to speak his heart. Together they stand in the middle of Gunnison with nothing but faith between them. But high in the Rockies, winter is closing in. And when old debts come calling, the law and the creditors demand a price that could tear them apart forever. She believes she's unworthy. He's never known a woman's touch. Yet in the silence of the mountains, their hearts beat louder than any storm. Still, secrets lie buried beneath the snow, an inheritance of gold, a preacher's doubt, and a sheriff's fear of justice. Will love and faith be strong enough to break chains of shame and debt? Or will the woman who thought she was too big be taken away before she learns she was chosen all along? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The stagecoach wheels clattered against the hard-packed dirt of Gunnison's main street, kicking up small clouds of dust that mixed with the light snow drifting down from steel-gray skies. The late November chill had already painted the town's wooden buildings with a delicate frosting of white, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from the depot's overhanging roof. Hiram Boone stood apart from the small crowd gathered to meet the stage, his tall frame making him seem like a pine tree among saplings. His weathered hands couldn't seem to keep still, turning and twisting his well-worn hat as he shifted from boot to boot. The knot in his stomach tightened with each passing minute. What if she took one look at him and decided to stay on the stage? What if his peculiar ways scared her off before he could even properly introduce himself? The stagecoach lurched to a stop, brake chains rattling. The driver called out a greeting to the waiting townspeople, his voice carrying on the crisp mountain air. Hiram's heart thundered in his chest as the door swung open. A plain black bonnet appeared first, pulled low as if its wearer wished to hide beneath its brim. Then Chloe Stoltzfus emerged, her substantial frame filling the narrow doorway as she carefully navigated the metal steps. Her dark dress was simple but neat, marking her Amish heritage as clearly as the covering on her head. She paused on the last step, and Hiram could see her hands trembling slightly as they gripped her carpet bag. Before anyone could speak a word of welcome, Chloe lifted her chin and declared in a clear voice tinged with resignation, "I'm too big for you." Several townsfolk chuckled, and whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Hiram felt heat rise in his cheeks, but not from embarrassment. Something about her bold honesty, the way she faced what she feared head-on, stirred his admiration. He lifted his gaze to meet hers, fighting past his usual awkwardness with words. "You're," he stammered, then found his footing. "You're perfect." The laughter died as quickly as a snuffed candle. In the sudden quiet, Hiram could hear the soft patter of snowflakes landing on his coat shoulders. Chloe's eyes widened, searching his face for any sign of mockery, but found only earnest truth there. "Let me help you with your bags, ma'am," Hiram offered, stepping forward. His large hands, calloused from years of working wood and leather, carefully took her carpet bag and trunk. Though the luggage was heavy, he handled it as gently as if it contained delicate china. They walked side by side down the wooden sidewalk toward the boarding house, their footsteps creating a mismatched rhythm on the planks. Neither seemed to know quite what to say. Hiram sneaked glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking, noting how her shoulders remained tense, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. The boarding house sat on the corner, its yellow paint cheerful despite the gray day. Mrs. Patterson, the owner, met them at the door with a warm smile that did much to ease the awkwardness between them. "Welcome to Gunnison, Miss Stoltzfus," she said, ushering them inside. The entryway smelled of fresh-baked bread and coffee, and a fire crackled invitingly in the parlor hearth. "I've got your room already upstairs, and supper will be served in an hour." Hiram cleared his throat. "I'd like to pay for Miss Stoltzfus's meal, if that's agreeable." He reached for his wallet, the leather worn smooth from years in his pocket. The money he counted out represented several days' work, but he wanted to show Chloe that he could provide for her needs. "That's very kind," Chloe said softly, the first words she'd spoken since her declaration at the depot. "But you needn't trouble yourself." "No trouble at all, ma'am." Hiram managed a small smile, though his stomach was too knotted to think about eating himself. Mrs. Patterson showed Chloe to her room, while Hiram waited downstairs, perched uncomfortably on the edge of a parlor chair that seemed too dainty for his frame. When Chloe returned, she'd removed her bonnet, revealing hair the color of winter wheat pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was flushed from the warmth of the house, giving her cheeks a pretty pink glow that made Hiram's heart skip. Supper was served in the boarding house dining room, where they sat across from each other at a small table near the window. The other guests cast curious glances their way, but Hiram barely noticed, too focused on not spilling his soup or saying something foolish. He picked at his food while Chloe ate with careful, measured bites, as if trying not to draw attention to herself. "Your letters mentioned you have a farm?" Chloe ventured after several minutes of silence. Hiram nodded, grateful for the opening. "Yes, ma'am." 20 acres up in the high country, with good water and timber. Built the cabin myself." He hesitated, then added, "It's plain living, but solid." "Plain suits me fine," she replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. After the meal, as the early winter darkness settled over the town, Hiram suggested they walk out to the stable where he'd left his mule. "I thought you might like to see how we'll be traveling tomorrow, if you're still willing to make the journey up to the farm." Chloe agreed, wrapping a worn shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. The snow had stopped, leaving the air crystal clear and sharp with cold. Their breath formed small clouds in the lamplight as they made their way to the livery stable. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and leather welcomed them. Hiram's mule, a sturdy brown creature named Daniel, lifted his head and nickered a greeting. Chloe approached the stall slowly, and Hiram watched as she extended her hand, letting Daniel sniff her palm. "He seems gentle," she observed, scratching behind the mule's ears. "He is. Sure-footed, too, which matters more in these mountains." Hiram patted Daniel's neck. "I've got a wagon for the trip up. It'll take most of the day, but I've packed plenty of blankets and food." Chloe nodded, but Hiram could see questions in her eyes as she studied him. Here in the quiet of the stable, away from the curious stares of townfolk, she seemed more at ease. Yet there was still a wariness about her, as if she couldn't quite believe that this tall, awkward man truly meant what he'd said at the depot. "Mr. Boone," she began, then paused, gathering her courage. "Why did you answer my letter? Surely there were other women who wrote to you, women who would be more suitable." Hiram felt the weight of her question, heard the pain behind it. He took his time responding, wanting to get the words right. "Your letter was honest," he said finally. "You wrote about wanting a simple life, about working hard and living by faith. You didn't try to make yourself sound fancy or pretend to be something you're not." He met her gaze directly. "I reckon that's worth more than any other measure of suitability." The lantern light cast soft shadows across Chloe's face as she absorbed his words. For a moment, Hiram thought he saw moisture gathering in her eyes, but she blinked it away quickly. Together they stood in the comfortable quiet of the stable, while outside, the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky. The November morning dawned bitter cold, with frost sparkling like scattered diamonds across the wagon tongue. Hiram's breath formed thick clouds as he adjusted the harness on Daniel, his movements careful and deliberate despite his numb fingers. He'd risen before first light to prepare for the journey, wanting everything to be perfect for Chloe's comfort. The boarding house door creaked open, and Chloe emerged wearing her dark dress and a thick shawl. Her carpetbag and trunk sat ready on the porch. She'd clearly been awake for some time. Her hair was neatly tucked beneath her covering, and her eyes were bright with determination. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Morning, Miss Stoltzfus." Hiram touched the brim of his hat. "I hope you slept well?" "Well enough." She glanced at the wagon, then back to him. "How long will the journey take?" Hiram gestured toward the mountains looming ahead, their peaks already touched with early sunlight. "Most of the day, I reckon. The road's steep in places, and Daniel here, well, he's sure-footed, but not exactly swift." The mule's ears twitched at the mention of his name, making Chloe smile slightly. She watched as Hiram loaded her trunk and carpet bag, securing them carefully under the wagon's canvas cover. "I've brought plenty of blankets for the back," he said, patting the padded bench seat. "You can ride comfortable there, out of the wind." "I'll sit up front," Chloe interrupted firmly. When Hiram looked uncertain, she added, "I'm not made of spun sugar, mister." "Boone. The cold won't break me." Hiram ducked his head, hiding a smile. "No, ma'am, I don't suppose it will." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, noting how she managed her own weight with dignity, accepting his steadying hand but not relying on it. Once she was settled, he passed her a thick wool blanket before climbing up beside her. The bench was wide enough for both of them to sit comfortably without touching, though Hiram was acutely aware of her presence. "Get up there, Daniel," he called softly, and the mule stepped forward, his hooves clopping steadily on the frozen ground. The wagon wheels creaked as they left Gunnison behind, following the road that wound up into the mountains. As the sun climbed higher, they passed several groups of miners heading to their claims, their picks and shovels strapped to their backs. The men's faces were weathered and hopeful, though few had found the riches they sought in these hills. Each time they passed fellow travelers, Hiram touched his hat in greeting. Near mid-morning, they came upon 2 Ute women carrying bundles of firewood along the road's edge. Their colorful skirts swished against the frosted grass, and their dark eyes watched the wagon approach with quiet dignity. Hiram immediately slowed Daniel to a stop. "Good morning, ladies," he said, removing his hat completely and bowing his head in respect. The women returned his greeting with slight nods before continuing on their way. Chloe watched this exchange with interest, noting how naturally the courtesy came to him. "You know them?" she asked, as they started moving again. "Their people were here long before any of us," Hiram replied simply. "Treating them with respect is just plain decent." Around noon, when the sun had warmed the air enough to melt the morning frost, Hiram guided the wagon off the road near a frozen creek. "Best we rest Daniel a spell," he said, helping Chloe down. "And we could both use some food, I expect." He worked efficiently, gathering dry wood and starting a small fire without any fuss or ceremony. Soon he had coffee brewing in a battered tin pot, its rich aroma mixing with the crisp mountain air. While the coffee heated, he brought out a loaf of bread and some jerky from his provisions. "It's not fancy," he apologized, offering Chloe the first piece of bread. "Fancy has never filled an empty stomach," she replied practically, accepting the food with a nod of thanks. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional snap of the fire and Daniel's soft snuffling as he grazed nearby. Hiram noticed how Chloe kept looking around at the mountain landscape, taking in the snow-dusted pines and the way the sunlight caught the ice crystals on the creek. When the coffee was ready, Hiram poured it carefully into 2 tin cups, handling Chloe's as if it were fine china as he passed it to her. The hot liquid steamed in the cold air, and Chloe wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully. "You don't talk much, do you, Mr. Boone?" she observed after a while. Hiram considered this. "Reckon I got used to silence, living up here alone, but I listen well enough." "That you do," she agreed softly, and they shared a look of understanding. The afternoon journey took them higher into the mountains, the wagon climbing steadily. Chloe remained alert despite the long hours, asking occasional questions about landmarks they passed or the names of different trees. Hiram answered each query thoughtfully, and she noticed how his voice grew more confident when speaking about the land he knew so well. As twilight began to settle over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Hiram pointed ahead. "There," he said quietly. "Home." The cabin came into view as they crested a small rise. It sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, its log walls solid and well-maintained. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, rising straight up in the still evening air. Hiram had arranged for a neighbor to start a fire earlier in the day, ensuring the house would be warm for their arrival. Daniel needed no guidance to turn into the yard, following the familiar path to where he knew his evening meal of oats waited. Hiram set the brake and climbed down, turning to help Chloe. She descended slowly, her muscles stiff from the long ride, and stood for a moment taking in her surroundings. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, with a small covered porch and 2 windows flanking the door. A stack of split firewood stood neatly against one wall, and she could see the shapes of other outbuildings in the gathering dusk. The clearing was indeed isolated, with no other homes in sight, but something about the peaceful solitude touched something deep in her heart. Chloe drew in a deep breath of the clean mountain air, tasting pine and wood smoke. Her eyes met Hiram's, who stood watching her reaction with barely concealed anxiety. "I might belong here after all," she whispered, her words barely audible but carrying clearly in the mountain quiet. Hiram's shoulders relaxed slightly at her words, and the ghost of a smile touched his lips as he moved to unhitch Daniel, leaving her to continue her contemplation of what might become her new home. Hiram pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepping aside to let Chloe enter first. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them, a welcome change from the mountain chill. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Chloe stood just inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cabin was neat and clean, with a swept wooden floor and orderly shelves. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its quilt pulled tight enough to bounce a coin. Everything spoke of careful maintenance, but the furnishings were clearly made for a smaller frame. Hiram cleared his throat. "It's simple, but solid. Built it myself, 5 years back." "You did fine work," Chloe said softly, running her hand along a smooth-planed shelf. Her gaze fell on a delicate rocking chair near the hearth, its wood worn to a soft sheen by years of use. Following her look, Hiram stepped forward. "That was my mother's." He gripped the chair's back, hesitated, then carefully lifted it. "Best move it to the corner for now. I'll start on a new one tomorrow, something sturdier." Chloe's cheeks flushed. "You needn't trouble yourself." "No trouble," Hiram interrupted gently, setting the chair in its new spot. "It's your home now. Everything should fit right." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Chloe busied herself with unwrapping her shawl, touched by his thoughtfulness but uncertain how to respond. "I put some rabbit stew on this morning," Hiram said, moving to the iron pot hanging near the fire. "Nothing fancy, but it should have simmered nice and tender by now." "I have bread," Chloe offered, reaching for her traveling basket. "Baked fresh in town this morning." Hiram nodded appreciatively, gathering 2 bowls from a shelf. The pottery was simple but clean, and he handled it with careful movements despite his large hands. He ladled generous portions of the stew, the rich aroma filling the cabin. Setting up for supper took on an almost ceremonial quality. Hiram placed a kerosene lamp on the table, its gentle light softening the cabin's shadows. Chloe unwrapped her loaf of bread, still fresh enough to release a wheaty scent when broken. They settled at the table, the furniture creaking slightly under their weight. "Would you like to say grace?" Hiram asked, folding his hands and bowing his head. Chloe closed her eyes and spoke the familiar words in German, her voice carrying the melody of her Pennsylvania Dutch upbringing. When she finished, she caught Hiram watching her with quiet interest. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Different from what I'm used to, but beautiful all the same." They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. The stew was indeed tender, seasoned with wild herbs that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations. After the meal, Chloe insisted on washing the dishes while Hiram banked the fire for the night. Then she turned to her carpet bag, drawing out the few precious possessions she'd brought with her. First came the quilt, its pattern a traditional 9-patch in deep blues and rich browns. "I made this for my hope chest," she explained, smoothing it with careful hands before laying it across the foot of the bed. Next, she placed her Bible on a shelf near the lamp. The leather binding was worn soft with use, its pages marked with pressed flowers and handwritten notes in the margins. Finally, she withdrew a small silver locket, holding it for a moment before setting it beside the Bible. Hiram watched as each item found its place, noting how these simple touches transformed his bachelor cabin into something warmer, more lived in. The shelf that had held only his few books now looked properly furnished with her belongings alongside his. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving snow against the window panes with increasing intensity. Hiram added another log to the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. The flames cast a cozy glow across the room as the storm gathered strength. "Sounds like we made it just in time," he observed, settling into a chair by the hearth. "Storm's setting in proper now." Chloe stood at the window, watching the snow swirl in the darkness. The silence felt different here than it had in her Amish community. Deeper somehow, but not unfriendly. Almost without thinking, she began to hum softly, an old hymn her mother had sung on winter evenings much like this one. The melody filled the cabin, weaving between the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind. Hiram sat very still, his hands folded in his lap, eyes closed. The tune stirred something in his memory. His own mother, singing as she rocked in that delicate chair, her voice carrying him to sleep on countless nights. When the hymn ended, the silence felt richer somehow, as if the cabin itself had absorbed the notes into its very walls. Hiram opened his eyes slowly, finding Chloe watching him with a hint of uncertainty. "My mother used to sing hymns," he said quietly. "Different ones than yours, but just as sweet. Haven't heard singing in this cabin since she passed." "I'm sorry if it brought sad memories," Chloe responded, her voice soft. "No," Hiram shook his head. "Not sad. Just remembered. Good memories, the kind that need keeping." The fire popped, sending up another shower of sparks. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The space felt less like Hiram's solitary shelter and more like what it might become, a home for two people learning to build a life together. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in soft rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Hiram stirred at the first light filtering through the frosted windows. He dressed quietly, pulling on thick woolen socks and his heavy boots. The cabin floor creaked beneath his weight as he made his way to the door. When he pulled it open, a wall of white greeted him. The storm had left drifts nearly waist-high against the cabin. Hiram grabbed his wooden snow shovel from beside the door and set to work, his breath coming out in steady white puffs as he carved a path through the deep snow. Inside, Chloe woke to the rhythmic scraping sound of the shovel. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and moved to the hearth, where embers still glowed from the night before. With practiced movements, she added kindling and small logs, coaxing the fire back to life. She found the cornmeal in Hiram's neat pantry and began preparing breakfast. The iron pot hung from its hook over the flames, and soon the thick smell of cornmeal mush filled the cabin. She stirred it carefully with a wooden spoon, making sure it didn't stick to the bottom. Hiram stomped his boots clean before coming back inside, his cheeks ruddy from exertion and cold. Paths cleared to the woodpile and the privy, he said, hanging his coat on its peg. Never seen snow quite this deep this early in the season. The mush is almost ready, Chloe replied, testing its consistency with her spoon. Will you fetch the molasses? They settled at the table, steam rising from their bowls. The silence between them felt different this morning, somehow both comfortable and expectant. Chloe drizzled molasses over her portion, watching the dark syrup create swirling patterns in the golden mush. My first husband, she began suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't what he seemed. Her fingers twisted in her apron as she spoke. Jacob Stoltzfus appeared so proper, so respected in our district. But he had secrets, gambling debts. He'd borrow money from one person to pay another, always promising the next harvest would set things right. Hiram listened quietly, his spoon forgotten in his bowl. When the fever took him, Chloe continued, those secrets came to light. The bishop discovered everything. All those debts fell to me, and the shame. She drew a shaky breath. The community helped pay what was owed, but I couldn't stay. Not with the whispers, the pitying looks. I'd brought disgrace to my family name. You didn't do anything wrong, Hiram said firmly, his deep voice gentle. Chloe's eyes met his, surprised by the conviction in his tone. Perhaps not. But shame doesn't always follow reason. Hiram nodded slowly, understanding in his expression. I know something about that kind of aloneness. He pushed his bowl aside, folding his large hands on the table. I was 16 when the fever swept through. Took both my parents within a week of each other. Folks offered to take me in, but he shrugged his broad shoulders. Couldn't bear their kindness. Felt too much like pity. How did you survive? Chloe asked softly. Already knew how to trap and hunt from Pa. Learned to fell trees proper. Sold timber to the sawmill in town. Built this cabin myself. Bit by bit. His eyes grew distant. Lonesome work, but honest. Just me and God up here in the high country. After breakfast, Hiram pulled on his coat again. Got something needs doing in the shed? He said, not quite meeting Chloe's eyes. Might take most of the day. Chloe watched through the window as he made his way to the small workshop behind the cabin. Soon she heard the steady rhythm of his saw cutting through wood, and occasionally the sharp rap of his hammer. Around midday, she wrapped some bread and cheese in a cloth and carried it out to him. The shed door stood open, sawdust covering the packed earth floor. Hiram stood at his workbench, carefully measuring a length of pine board. Several finished pieces leaned against the wall. The makings of a chair, she realized, with a seat and back sized generously. Thought you might want some help, she offered, setting down the food. I'm good with my hands. Hiram looked up, surprised but pleased. Could use help with the sanding, if you're willing. Need to get these pieces smooth as silk before we put them together. They worked through the afternoon, the shed warm despite the winter chill outside. Chloe ran sandpaper over each piece of wood until it felt like velvet beneath her touch. Hiram showed her how to apply the oil in slow, even strokes, bringing out the rich grain of the pine. As the light began to fade, Hiram fitted the last pieces together, his movements careful and precise despite his large hands. He checked each joint, tested each connection, making sure everything was secure. Ready to bring it inside? He asked finally, wiping his hands on his trousers. Chloe nodded, her heart beating a little faster as Hiram lifted the chair easily and carried it through the snow to the cabin. He set it down near the hearth, stepping back to look at it critically. Best try it, he said quietly. Make sure it suits. Chloe approached the chair slowly, taking in its sturdy construction and wide seat. The back was tall enough to support her completely, and the arms were broad and strong. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, but more than that, it was made for her, with thought and care for her comfort. She sat down carefully, feeling the solid support beneath her. The chair creaked once, then settled, holding her weight perfectly. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them, spilling onto her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, running her hand along the smooth wooden arm. "No one has ever—" She couldn't finish the sentence, overcome by the simple kindness of this quiet man who had built something just for her. Hiram only nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright in the firelight. He stood awkwardly for a moment, pride and satisfaction evident in his stance despite his silence. The chair rocked gently as Chloe shifted, its movements as steady and reliable as the man who had crafted it. Outside, the snow began falling again, softer now, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed from more than just the crackling fire. The week settled into a gentle rhythm, like the steady tick of Hiram's grandfather clock marking the hours. Each morning, Chloe rose before dawn to stoke the fire and start the day's bread. The familiar motions of kneading dough brought comfort, reminding her of quieter days in her Amish community. As pale winter sunlight filtered through the cabin's small windows, the sweet smell of baking bread filled every corner. Outside, Hiram's axe rang against wood in a steady cadence. He worked methodically, building up their store of firewood before the deeper snows could arrive. Sometimes Chloe paused in her work just to watch him through the window, admiring how his powerful shoulders moved with each swing, how carefully he stacked each split log. "Won't be able to reach the woodpile once the drifts get too high," he explained one morning, carrying in an armload of pine logs. "Best to have plenty close to hand." Chloe nodded, understanding the wisdom of preparation. She had spent the morning sewing curtains from fabric she'd brought in her trunk, transforming the cabin's stark windows into something more homelike. The cloth was simple, just plain muslin, but the careful stitches spoke of care and permanence. While she worked, she often found herself humming the old hymns she'd grown up with. The familiar German words brought peace to her heart, and sometimes she caught Hiram pausing in his own tasks to listen, a soft expression crossing his weathered face. Each day brought new tasks. Hiram hauled water from the creek before it froze solid, filling every available barrel. He patched weak spots in the roof, explaining how the weight of snow could cause trouble if they weren't careful. Chloe learned the peculiarities of the cook stove, discovered which floorboards creaked the loudest, and slowly began to feel less like a stranger in this space. Their suppers together became precious times. Though neither was particularly talkative by nature, laughter began to bubble up more frequently between them. Hiram would share small stories about the day's work, and Chloe found herself telling him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about helping her mother with the quilting and the canning. When Sunday arrived, Chloe woke with butterflies in her stomach. Church would be their first real appearance together in town, and she knew what to expect. She'd faced those looks before, the sideways glances, the whispered comments about her size, the judgment in people's eyes. She dressed carefully in her best dress, plain black wool with a proper high collar, and pinned her Amish prayer covering in place. Through the mirror's reflection, she saw Hiram adjusting his string tie, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday suit. The morning air was crisp as they hitched the mule to the wagon. Hiram helped Chloe up onto the seat, his large hands steady and respectful. The wagon creaked as they started down the mountain road, the mule's hooves crunching through patches of frozen snow. "Been a while since I attended regular," Hiram admitted, handling the reins with care. "Mostly kept to reading my Bible up at the cabin." "Why did you stop going?" Chloe asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment. "After my parents passed, it was hard. Folks meant well, but their kindness." He trailed off, then added, "Sometimes it's easier to worship alone in God's mountains." The little log church came into view as they rounded the last bend into town. Several wagons were already tied up outside, and people in their Sunday best were filing through the door. As Hiram helped Chloe down from the wagon, the conversations around them quieted noticeably. Inside, The wooden pews were hard and narrow. Chloe felt the heat rise in her cheeks as she tried to settle herself, conscious of how much space she took up. Hiram sat close beside her, his solid presence reassuring. She could hear the murmurs rippling through the congregation, some curious, some disapproving. That's Hiram Boone's mail-order bride. An Amish woman? Up in those mountains? Lord above, she's a big one. Chloe kept her eyes forward, focused on the simple wooden cross hanging on the wall. Beside her, she felt Hiram stiffen at some of the comments, but he remained silent, his Bible open on his knee. The preacher, Elias Ward, was a lean man with gray at his temples. His sermon spoke of God's grace and mercy, though Chloe noticed his gaze falling on her and Hiram more than once. After the final hymn, people began to file out, some nodding politely, others clearly avoiding their eyes. Preacher Ward met them at the door, his handshake firm but his smile reserved. "Brother Boone," he said, "it's good to see you back in God's house." He turned to Chloe, studying her prayer covering. "And this is your bride?" "Yes, sir," Hiram answered. "This is Chloe Stoltzfus." "Welcome, Sister Stoltzfus," the preacher said kindly, though Chloe could sense his uncertainty. "I trust you'll find our little congregation welcoming." Outside, more whispers followed them to the wagon. Chloe held her head high, though her heart ached. She'd hoped, somehow, that things would be different here, so far from her old life. But people's judgment seemed to follow her everywhere. The ride home was quiet at first, the mule plodding steadily uphill. The silence grew heavy between them until Chloe couldn't bear it anymore. She had to know. "Hiram," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you regret it?" "Sending for me." The wagon wheels creaked as Hiram drew the mule to a stop. He sat very still for a moment, his large hands gripping the reins. When he turned to look at her, his eyes were clear and steady. "No," he said simply. "I asked God for a companion. He sent you." The words wrapped around Chloe's heart like a warm blanket. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wanted to believe him completely, but old doubts died hard. Hiram clicked to the mule, and they started moving again. The mountain air was sharp and clean in Chloe's lungs as they climbed higher, leaving the town and its whispers behind. Ahead, she could see smoke rising from their cabin's chimney, the fire she'd banked that morning still burning, waiting for their return. As the wagon rolled into the yard, Chloe studied the little cabin with new eyes. In just a week, it had begun to feel like home. Her curtains hung in the windows, the wood she'd helped sand and oil gleamed in the afternoon light, and the smell of her fresh bread still lingered in the air. The evening shadows stretched long across the cabin's yard as Hiram sat on the porch, his rough hands moving steadily over the steel jaws of his trapline. Winter was coming fast to the mountains, and good pelts would help see them through. The metal clinked softly as he worked, checking each spring and trigger with careful attention. Chloe watched him through the window while she kneaded bread dough on the table. His broad shoulders were hunched against the cold, breath-forming clouds in the frosty air. The sight of him there, so solid and present, brought a warmth to her heart she was still getting used to. A sound drew her attention, the crunch of boots on frozen ground. A boy of perhaps 12 years trudged up the path, his cheeks red from the climb. Chloe recognized him as Tommy Wells, whose family had a claim further down the mountain. "Evening, Mr. Boone," the boy called out. "Got a letter here from Mrs. Stoltzfus, Mrs. Boone." Hiram nodded toward the door. "Better take it inside to her, Tommy." "Your ma know you're up this high so late?" "Yes, sir. Pa said I could deliver it on my way back from checking our spring." Tommy stamped his feet on the porch, then stepped inside, pulling an envelope from his coat. Chloe wiped her hands on her apron, leaving dusty flower prints. "Thank you, Tommy. Would you like a piece of yesterday's bread?" still fresh enough. The boy's eyes lit up, but he shook his head. "Can't stay, ma'am." Getting dark fast, he handed her the letter and hurried back out, calling a farewell to Hiram as he passed. The envelope felt heavy in Chloe's hands. The return address made her blood run cold. Whitman and Sons, Mercantile Brokers, Philadelphia. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The words on the page seemed to swim before her eyes. "Madam, having traced your whereabouts to Colorado Territory, we write to inform you that the outstanding debt of your late husband, Abraham Stoltzfus, remains unsettled. The sum of $842 plus accumulated interest must be paid in full within 30 days of receipt of this notice. Should you fail to meet this obligation, we have arranged with the Western Mining Corporation to secure your employment at their Red Mountain camp until such time as the debt is discharged through labor. Yours truly, J.P. Whitman, Esquire." Chloe's legs went weak. She sank into Hiram's newly built chair, the paper crumpling in her grip. $800 might as well be $8,000. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. And the mining camp? She had heard whispers about how women were treated there. Through a fog of panic, she heard Hiram's boots on the porch, coming in for supper. She quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, trying to steady her breathing. "Stew's about ready," she managed to say, her voice surprisingly level as she rose to check the pot hanging over the fire. But her hands shook as she ladled the hot food into bowls, and when she tried to pass Hiram his portion, some splashed over the rim. "I'm sorry," she whispered, reaching for a cloth. "Chloe." Hiram's voice was gentle. "What's troubling you?" She couldn't meet his eyes. "The letter." Her throat felt tight. "I should have told you everything before. About Abraham, about why I had to leave the community." Hiram set his bowl aside, giving her his full attention. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, but his eyes were kind. The whole story spilled out then, how Abraham had borrowed heavily to expand their farm, how he had gambled away much of it at cards, how he had died suddenly of fever before any of the debts were paid. How the shame of it had forced her to leave her Amish district, seeking a fresh start through the marriage broker's advertisement. "And now they've found me," she finished, pulling out the crumpled letter. "They'll take me away to work in the mining camp if I can't pay." She waited for the coldness to come into his face, for him to realize what a burden she truly was. Instead, Hiram reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin. "We'll face it together," he said simply. Chloe stared at him, hardly daring to believe. "But it's not your debt to bear. You didn't know about any of this when you sent for me." "You're my wife now," Hiram said firmly. "Your troubles are mine to share." The stew grew cold in their bowls as they talked through options. Hiram had some savings from his trapping, but nowhere near enough. The cabin and land were his free and clear, but no bank would loan against mountain property with winter coming on. When they finally went to bed, sleep eluded them both. Chloe lay rigid beneath the quilt in her small room, listening to Hiram's heavy footsteps pacing the main room. After a while, she heard the door open and close softly. Rising from her bed, she went to the window. Hiram stood in the yard, his tall figure dark against the starlit snow. His head was bowed, and though she couldn't make out the words, she could see his lips moving in what looked like prayer. "Please, Lord," he whispered to the cold night air, "don't take her from me. Not when I've just found her." Chloe's heart clenched at the raw emotion in his voice. She sank to her knees beside the bed, her own prayers joining his beneath the vast mountain sky. "Dear Father in heaven," she murmured in German, the language of her childhood prayers, "show us a way through this valley. Give us strength to face whatever comes." The hours crept by. Hiram remained outside, his breath frosting in the starlight, while Chloe kept her vigil by the window. Neither of them had ever felt so alone, yet somehow knowing the other was near made it bearable. Dawn was still hours away when Hiram finally came back inside. Chloe heard him add wood to the dying fire, then settle into his chair. The familiar creak of the floorboards was oddly comforting, a reminder that for now at least, they were still together in this home they were building. She touched the window glass, frost cold beneath her fingers. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human troubles. But in here, in this cabin that was slowly becoming home, someone cared what happened to her. Someone was willing to stand beside her and face whatever came. For the first time since the letter arrived, Chloe felt a tiny spark of hope. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she wasn't alone anymore. The morning after the letter arrived, frost painted delicate patterns across the cabin windows. Chloe rose early, her heart heavy but her hands steady as she kindled the fire. Through the glass, she watched Hiram already at work, his broad shoulders swinging the axe in a steady rhythm. The sound of splitting wood echoed through the crisp mountain air. Over a breakfast of cornmeal mush, Hiram laid out his plans. "I'll set more trap lines," he said, his voice quiet but determined. "Maybe take some extra timber down to the sawmill." Chloe stirred her cooling mush. "How much does a good pelt fetch?" $2 for beaver, if the fur's prime, less for rabbit. He didn't need to say what they both knew. It wouldn't be nearly enough to cover $842 of debt. "Then I'll help," Chloe said firmly. "Show me how to set snares. I can gather kindling too, while you work the bigger trees." Hiram looked up, concern creasing his brow. "The snow's deep out there. And the cold." "I'm stronger than I look," she countered, squaring her shoulders. "And we don't have the luxury of pride anymore." After breakfast, Hiram brought out an old pair of snowshoes. The rawhide webbing was weathered but sound. He showed Chloe how to adjust the leather bindings around her boots, then demonstrated the shuffling walk needed to stay atop the snow. Her first attempts sent her sprawling face first into the drifts, but Hiram never laughed, just helped her up each time with those strong, gentle hands. By midday, she had mastered the basic motion well enough to follow him into the woods. The forest in winter held a different kind of beauty. Snow bent the evergreen boughs, and their boots left parallel tracks across the pristine white. Hiram pointed out rabbit runs and showed her how to set simple wire snares. His huge fingers worked with surprising delicacy as he demonstrated the proper knots. "Like this?" Chloe asked, setting her first snare. The wire felt awkward in her cold, numbed fingers. Hiram examined her work and nodded. "That'll hold. You've got steady hands." They worked their way through the trees, Chloe gathering fallen branches for kindling while Hiram checked his larger traps. The physical labor helped keep her mind from dwelling on the letter, though it never fully left her thoughts. By late afternoon, they had a decent pile of wood and 2 rabbits from older snares. Hiram showed Chloe how to field dress them, his movements quick and efficient. The sharp knife glinted in the fading light as he demonstrated where to cut. Without thinking, Chloe began to sing as she worked. It was an old hymn she had learned as a child, one that spoke of finding strength in times of trouble. The German words felt familiar on her tongue. "Gott ist die Liebe, lässt mich erlösen. Gott ist die Liebe, liebt auch mich." To her surprise, a deep voice joined in on the second verse. Hiram's bass complemented her alto perfectly, though he sang in English. "God's love is eternal, His mercy enduring. God's love is eternal, He cares for me." Their voices trailed off, and they stared at each other in amazement. Then Chloe couldn't help it. She laughed. The sound bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, and after a moment, Hiram's deeper chuckle joined in. "I didn't know you could sing," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mother taught me hymns," he replied, his eyes distant with memory. "She said music makes any work lighter." She was right about that. Chloe picked up the cleaned rabbits. "And about teaching you to sing?" The walk home seemed shorter with their voices joined in harmony. They worked through several hymns they both knew, their breath frosting in the cold air. For a little while, the weight of worry lifted from Chloe's shoulders. That evening, after a supper of rabbit stew and the last of the bread, they sat before the fire. Hiram had been quiet for some time, staring into the flames. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "Maybe we should ride into Gunnison tomorrow. Talk to Sheriff Dixon, see if there's any legal way to delay things, or work out some kind of payment plan." Chloe's hands stilled in her mending. "Do you think the sheriff would help?" "He's not a bad man," Hiram said. "Just careful about choosing sides. But it's worth trying. Better than waiting for them to come to us." She studied his profile, noting the determination in his jaw. "The creditors probably already have the law on their side. They wouldn't have sent that letter if they weren't sure." "Maybe so." Hiram poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "But I aim to try anyway. Can't just sit here and let them take you." The simple declaration warmed her more than the fire. This quiet mountain man, who had every right to wash his hands of her troubles, was instead willing to face down the law for her sake. "Thank you," she whispered. Hiram looked up, confusion crossing his face. "For what?" "For not sending me away when you learned about the debt. For being willing to help fight this battle." "Told you before. We're in this together now." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm engulfing her work-roughened fingers. "Whatever comes." They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its lonely cry echoing off the mountainsides. But inside the cabin, Chloe felt somehow safer than she had in years, despite the threat hanging over them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The ride to town would be cold, and there was no guarantee the sheriff would even agree to see them. But tonight, watching the firelight play across Hiram's steady features, Chloe allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this together. The evening wore on, and they began making plans for the morning journey. They would need to leave early to reach town before the sheriff's office closed. Chloe would pack bread and jerky for the trip, while Hiram made sure the mule was properly shod for the icy trails. Neither spoke their deepest fears, that the law might take her away then and there, that this might be their last quiet evening together in the cabin they were making into a home. Instead, they focused on practical details, clinging to normalcy like a shield against tomorrow's uncertainties. Saturday dawned bitter cold, the kind that made bones ache and breath freeze. Hiram hitched the mule to the wagon, while Chloe wrapped extra quilts around her shoulders. The wooden wheels creaked against the frozen ground as they set out for Gunnison. Ice glazed the rutted road, forcing them to travel at a crawl. The mule picked its way carefully, steam rising from its flanks. Hiram kept the reins loose, trusting the animal's sure-footedness. Neither he nor Chloe spoke much, both lost in thoughts of what awaited them in town. Around noon, they shared a simple meal of bread and dried apple slices, huddled together for warmth on the wagon seat. Chloe's teeth chattered despite the quilts, but she refused Hiram's offer to stop and build a fire. "We need to reach town before dark," she insisted. The sun was low when they finally rolled into Gunnison. The streets were quiet, most folks already home for supper, but those still out turned to stare as the wagon passed. Chloe heard the whispers clearly in the still air. "That's the Amish woman. Heard she brought debts with her. Lord, she's too big for him." Hiram's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he moved closer on the seat until his shoulder pressed against hers, solid and warm. The simple gesture steadied her. They stopped first at the mercantile, which was still open despite the late hour. The bell above the door jangled as they entered. Inside, kerosene lamps cast yellow light on shelves of dry goods. The shopkeeper's wife watched them with undisguised curiosity. "We need flour," Chloe said quietly to Hiram, "and lamp oil. Winter's far from over." He nodded and reached for his pocket, but Chloe was faster. She pulled out her small purse, counted the coins inside. Just enough for what they needed, with 2 pennies to spare. "I'll pay," she said firmly. "These are household necessities." Hiram started to protest, but something in her expression stopped him. He understood. She needed to contribute, to prove her worth to herself as much as to others. He carried the purchases back to the wagon while she settled the bill. The sheriff's office was their next stop. The building sat dark and empty, but light glowed from the saloon next door. Hiram tied the mule and helped Chloe down from the wagon. They found Sheriff Dixon inside the saloon, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as they entered, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Evening, Boone," he said, nodding to Hiram. "Mrs. Stoltzfus." Hiram removed his hat, twisting the brim in his large hands. "Sheriff, we need to talk about these creditors coming after Mrs. Stoltzfus." The sheriff sighed, gesturing for them to sit. The wooden chairs creaked under their weight. "Not much to discuss, I'm afraid. The law's clear on debts. They've got papers showing what's owed." "But surely there's some way," Hiram began. Dixon shook his head. $842 is a mighty sum. They've got the right to collect however they see fit. He glanced at Chloe, including taking it in labor. Chloe's hands clenched in her lap, but she held her voice steady. "The mining camp, you mean?" "That's their usual way, yes." The sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, but my hands are tied." "Law's law." They left the office with heavy hearts. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes catching in Chloe's bonnet. The church bell was ringing, calling people to the Saturday evening service. "We should go," Hiram said suddenly. "Been too long since I attended proper?" Chloe looked at him in surprise, but nodded. Together they walked through the swirling snow to the small wooden church. Lamplight spilled from its windows, and the sound of tuning voices drifted out. Inside, the congregation had already begun singing. The familiar hymn wrapped around Chloe like a warm embrace. Without thinking, she joined in, her clear alto rising above the other voices. Beside her, Hiram's deep bass provided harmony. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me." The song ended, and Preacher Ward stepped forward to lead the service. His eyes widened slightly at seeing Hiram and Chloe, but he recovered quickly. "Welcome, friends. We gather tonight in his name." Before the preacher could continue, Hiram stood. His height seemed to fill the small church as he faced the congregation. "Begging your pardon, preacher," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But I've something to say first." A murmur ran through the gathered people. Chloe looked up at Hiram, wondering what he meant to do. "This woman beside me," Hiram continued, "came to these mountains as a stranger. But God sent her to me, and I aim to stand by her." He turned to face Chloe directly. "Before God and these witnesses, I claim you as my wife. Whatever troubles come, we'll face them together." The church fell silent. Preacher Ward stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Now, Hiram, there are proper procedures." "With respect, preacher," Hiram interrupted, still looking at Chloe, "I'm not asking permission. I'm declaring what's true in my heart and before God." Tears spilled down Chloe's cheeks. She reached for Hiram's hand, gripping it tightly. In that moment, the whispers and stares didn't matter. She was seen, truly seen, by this quiet man who had opened his heart to her. From the back of the church, a voice began to sing. Others joined in, the harmony swelling until it filled the small space. "Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love." The congregation embraced them with song, and for that one evening, Chloe felt the warmth of acceptance wash over her. She sang with them, her voice strong and clear, while Hiram's hand remained steady in hers. Later, as they prepared to leave, several women pressed small packages of food into Chloe's hands: bread, dried fruit, a jar of preserved peaches. "For the long winter," they said, smiling. The preacher, though still looking uncertain, offered a brief prayer for their safety on the road home. Morning light filtered through the cabin's frosted windows, painting golden patterns across the rough-hewn floor. Chloe hummed softly as she kneaded bread dough on the table, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The memory of last night's church service, of Hiram's bold declaration, and the congregation's acceptance wrapped around her like a warm shawl. Hiram had gone out at dawn to check his trap lines, promising to return by noon. The cabin felt different now, not just a shelter, but truly home. Her quilt brightened one wall, dried herbs hung from the rafters, and the sturdy chair he'd made just for her waited by the hearth. Even the morning's chores felt blessed, each movement a quiet prayer of thanksgiving. The bread was just going into the Dutch oven when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, their hooves crunching through the crusty snow. Her hands froze mid-motion. This was no friendly neighbor's visit, not with so many riders. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window. 4 men on horseback emerged from the tree line. Her heart sank as she recognized Sheriff Dixon's badge glinting in the winter sun. Beside him rode 3 well-dressed men, their faces hard as granite. The creditors. They'd found her. Chloe's legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand straight as she opened the cabin door. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the jingle of harness and the snort of horses. "Mrs. Stoltzfus," the tallest creditor said, dismounting. His expensive coat marked him as a man of means, but his eyes were cold. "I believe you know why we're here." Before she could answer, the crunch of snow announced Hiram's return. He strode from the woods, rifle in one hand, 3 rabbit carcasses in the other. His face darkened at the sight of the visitors. "Get off my land," he growled, dropping the rabbits and gripping his rifle tighter. Sheriff Dixon raised his hands placatingly. "Now, Boone, let's keep this peaceful. These gentlemen have legal papers." The tall creditor pulled a folded document from his coat. "Indeed." Mrs. Stoltzfus's late husband borrowed $842 from our banking consortium. With interest, the debt now stands at $917. He smiled thinly. "We've come to collect." Hiram moved to stand beside Chloe, his presence solid as a mountain. "She's my wife now. Her debts are mine." "That's not how the law works," another creditor spoke up. "The debt follows her, regardless of marriage. And since you clearly can't pay such a sum," he gestured at the humble cabin, "we'll take it in labor. 3 years at the mining camp should settle accounts." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. She'd heard stories about women forced to work in the mining camps, cooking and cleaning for hundreds of men, treated little better than slaves. Hiram's hand twitched toward the axe handle leaning against the cabin wall. "You'll not take her anywhere." "Hiram, no." Chloe gripped his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Violence would only make things worse. "Please." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Boone. They've got the law on their side." "The law?" Hiram spat the words. "What about God's law? What about mercy?" The tall creditor folded his papers with precise movements. "We'll give you 3 days. Have her ready to travel by noon on Wednesday," his gray eyes fixed on Chloe. "Pack warm clothing. The mining camp gets cold. And if we refuse," Hiram's voice was dangerous, "then I'll return with deputies and take her by force." The creditor remounted his horse. 3 days, Mrs. Stoltzfus. Make your peace with it." They watched the riders disappear into the trees. Only when they were gone did Chloe realize she was shaking. Hiram led her inside, where the bread was starting to burn in the Dutch oven. "We'll find a way," he said, helping her rescue the loaf. "I've got some savings. Maybe I could sell the mule." Chloe shook her head. It wouldn't be enough. And you need the mule for your work. She touched his rough cheek gently. You've done more for me than anyone ever has, Hiram Boone, but I won't see you ruined for my sake. They argued through the afternoon, Hiram insisting he could find the money somehow, Chloe knowing in her heart it was impossible. When evening came, they sat in heavy silence by the fire. Finally, Hiram's exhaustion overtook him, and he dozed in his chair. Chloe watched him sleep, memorizing every detail of his face in the firelight. Such a good man, sent to her by God's grace, but she couldn't let him destroy himself trying to save her. Moving quietly, she gathered her few possessions: the quilt, her Bible, a shawl, and some bread. Tears fell silently as she folded a note and left it on the table. Better to slip away now, spare him the pain of watching them take her. Maybe she could find work in another town, earn enough to pay the debt honestly. She knelt beside his chair, pressing a kiss to his work-roughened hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me I was worthy of love." The cabin door creaked slightly as she opened it. Cold air rushed in, carrying the distant howl of wolves. Chloe hesitated, looking back one last time at the only true home she'd ever known. Then she stepped out into the darkness, leaving only footprints in the newly fallen snow. The mountain cold bit through Chloe's woolen dress as she trudged through knee-deep snow. Her quilt-wrapped bundle clutched tight against her chest. She followed the rough trail leading down toward Gunnison. Stars still glittered overhead, though a faint gray light touched the eastern horizon. Each step felt heavier than the last. She'd left a note explaining everything, how she couldn't bear to see Hiram impoverish himself trying to save her, how leaving now was better than watching the shame in his eyes when they dragged her away. The memory of his sleeping face by the firelight made her chest ache. But this was right. This was merciful. The wind picked up, driving icy particles against her cheeks. Chloe pulled her shawl tighter, trying to remember the way down the mountain. In daylight, the trail was clear enough, but in this pre-dawn darkness, every snow-covered tree looked the same. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. She'd barely slept these past days, worry gnawing at her like a hungry wolf. A branch cracked somewhere behind her. Chloe froze, heart hammering. Was it a mountain lion? A bear? She'd heard stories of what prowled these heights, but the sound that followed wasn't an animal's growl. It was the scrape of a cabin door opening, carried on the wind. Hiram! He must have woken at the draft from her departure. Panic spurred her forward. She couldn't let him find her, couldn't bear another goodbye. But the snow was so deep, her skirts so heavy. Each step became a battle. Her breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the starlight. Behind her, she heard the distinctive creak of wagon wheels. He must have hitched up the mule in record time. Tears froze on her cheeks as she pushed herself harder. The trail curved around a stand of aspens, and her foot caught on a hidden root. She stumbled, falling face first into the snow. For a moment, she lay there, the cold seeping through her clothes. Maybe this was God's answer, to let the mountain take her, solving everyone's problems at once. But even as the thought formed, she heard Hiram's voice calling her name, rough with fear. "Chloe! Chloe, where are you?" She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook too badly. The bundle with her quilt had fallen just out of reach. How long had she been walking? An hour? 2? The sky was definitely lighter now, though heavy clouds promised more snow. The wagon sounds grew closer. Then came the crunch of boots running through snow, and suddenly Hiram was there, his massive frame blocking out the stars above her. "Dear God," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. "You're half frozen." Chloe couldn't meet his eyes. "I had to go," she whispered. "The debt. I can't ruin your life. You've worked so hard for everything you have." His hands were gentle as he helped her sit up, brushing snow from her face and hair. My life? His voice cracked. Without you, what life would that be? Just an empty cabin and cold ashes? But the mining camp? No. The word came out like a prayer and a curse combined. I won't let them take you. We'll find another way. He gathered her quilt bundle, then lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Chloe wanted to protest. She was too heavy. He'd hurt himself. But she couldn't seem to form the words. Her whole body trembled with cold and exhaustion. The wagon waited just around the bend, the old mule stamping impatiently. Hiram settled her on the seat, wrapping his own coat around her before climbing up himself. As he turned the wagon carefully on the narrow trail, he began to pray aloud, his deep voice steady despite the tears she could see on his cheeks. Lord God, give me strength to protect what you've blessed me with. Show me the way to keep her safe. She's everything I never dared hope for, everything I need. Please, Father, don't let them take her. Chloe leaned against his shoulder, her shivers slowly easing as his warmth seeped into her. The eastern sky had turned pearl gray, though heavy clouds were rolling in from the west. The first snowflakes began to fall as they approached the cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low, but wasn't quite out. Hiram added logs while Chloe stood numbly by the door, unsure what to do with herself. When the flames caught properly, he turned to her with such pain in his eyes that it stole her breath. Why didn't you wake me? He asked softly. Why try to face this alone? I thought, she swallowed hard, I thought it would be easier. A clean break before they came to take me anyway. You've done so much already, given me a home, treated me with respect. I couldn't bear to see you throw everything away trying to save me from my own mistakes. Hiram shook his head slowly. Then, to her surprise, he knelt beside her chair, the one he'd built just for her. His big, calloused hands enclosed hers, warm and steady. Listen to me, Chloe Stoltzfus. Nothing in this cabin means anything without you here. Not the walls I built, not the furs I've trapped, not one single thing. When you came down that stagecoach step, I knew God had answered every prayer I was too scared to pray. His voice roughened. I will not let you go. Not to debt collectors, not to mining camps, not to anywhere. Whatever comes, we face it together. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the snow fell harder. But here in this moment, Chloe felt warmer than she had in years. She squeezed his hands, her heart too full for words. They sat like that as dawn crept fully into day, the storm sealing them away from the world. Whatever happened when the creditors returned, they would face it as one. For now, that was enough. The fire had burned low again when Hiram suddenly stood, his expression intense in the fading light. Chloe watched from her chair as he paced the cabin's length, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. Finally, he turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. There's something I need to show you. He moved to the corner where his bed stood, pushing it aside with careful strength. Chloe leaned forward, curiosity overtaking her exhaustion as he knelt and began prying at the floorboards. One plank lifted away, revealing a space beneath. From this hidden compartment, Hiram withdrew a battered wooden chest no bigger than a Bible. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it to the table. The lantern light caught the worn brass latch as he opened it, revealing yellowed papers inside. Chloe noticed how gently he handled them, like precious things that might crumble at too rough a touch. These were my father's, he explained, carefully unfolding what appeared to be a legal document. Before the fever took him and Ma, he had a claim up in the high country, a gold claim. Chloe's breath caught. Gold? Hiram nodded, spreading the deed on the table. His finger traced the careful script. It's all legal and proper. He found color in the stream there. Real gold, not fool's gold. But he never worked it much. Said he'd rather earn an honest living by timber than risk getting gold fever. And you've never... Chloe left the question hanging. No. Hiram's voice was soft. Felt like it would be disrespecting his wishes. He always said gold could turn a good man bad if he let it. He looked up, meeting her eyes. But maybe God let me keep this for a reason. Maybe it's not about greed now, but about protection, about providing. Chloe studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the conflict there. This wasn't a decision he'd made lightly. You're sure? I've been praying on it since the creditors came. He folded the deed carefully. The claim's about 4 hours up near Thunder Ridge. If we leave at first light, we could be there by midday. Hope flickered in Chloe's chest, fragile as the lantern's flame. Even with all this snow? The mule can manage. I know the way. He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. Will you trust me? Chloe turned her hand over, gripping his firmly. With my life. They spent the next hour preparing. Chloe packed bread and jerky while Hiram gathered tools, picks, pans, and canvas sacks. They laid everything by the door, ready for dawn's first light. Sleep came in fits and starts, both too anxious about the journey ahead to rest deeply. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when they hitched the mule to the wagon. Frost sparkled on every surface, and their breath formed clouds in the bitter air. Hiram helped Chloe up onto the seat, tucking blankets around her before climbing up himself. The mule's hooves crunched through the frozen crust of snow as they set out. The journey was slow and treacherous. The wagon wheels struggled through drifts, and twice they had to stop to clear fallen branches from their path. Hiram kept one hand on the reins, the other often reaching out to steady Chloe when the wagon jolted. They climbed steadily higher into the mountains, the air growing thinner and colder with each mile. Around mid-morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds, making the snow-covered landscape glitter like diamonds. Chloe gasped at the beauty of it, despite her chattering teeth. Hiram smiled, pointing to a ridge ahead. That's Thunder Ridge. The claim's just below it, where 3 pines grow together like a trinity. The last mile was the hardest. The trail narrowed dangerously, barely wide enough for the wagon. Hiram guided the mule with expert care, murmuring encouragement. Finally, they reached a small plateau where 3 massive pine trees stood sentinel, just as he'd described. This is it, Hiram said softly, setting the brake. This is where Pa found the gold. They climbed down carefully, the snow past their knees in places. Hiram led Chloe to a partially frozen stream that cut through the plateau. The water ran crystal clear over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. Pa showed me how to pan here, that last summer before the fever. Hiram's voice was thick with memory as he knelt by the stream. He pulled out one of the pans he'd brought, demonstrating the motion. You scoop like this, then swirl careful-like. The gold's heavier than the sand, so it sinks to the bottom. Chloe knelt beside him, ignoring the cold seeping through her skirts. She watched intently as he worked, sifting through the gravelly bottom of the stream. For several long minutes, there was nothing but the sound of water and their breathing. Then Hiram's hands stilled. Look, he whispered. In the bottom of the pan, mixed with the black sand, were tiny flakes that caught the sun like fallen stars. Chloe clutched his arm, hardly daring to breathe. Is that... Gold, Hiram confirmed. Real gold. He carefully tipped the flakes into one of the canvas sacks, then began panning again. With proof like this, we can stake our claim proper. Maybe even find enough to settle your debt outright. They worked side by side for the next hour, taking turns with the pan while sharing the bread and jerky. Each time they found more flakes, hope grew stronger. Chloe's fingers were numb with cold, but her heart was warm with possibility. Your father was a wise man, she said as they packed up their samples. Knowing this was here but not letting it rule him. Hiram nodded, securing the precious sacks. He used to say true riches aren't what you take from the earth, but what you build on it. Family, home, love. He looked at her intently. I reckon he'd understand us using it now, though, to protect what matters. The sun was past its peak as they prepared for the journey home. They had several sacks of promising samples, enough, they hoped, to prove the claim's worth. As Hiram helped Chloe back into the wagon, a few snowflakes began to fall. Storm's coming, he noted, squinting at the clouds building over Thunder Ridge. But we've got what we came for. God willing, it'll be enough. Chloe touched the canvas sacks tucked safely under the seat, each one representing a chance at freedom from the debt that had haunted her. But more than that, they represented Hiram's sacrifice, giving up his father's principle to protect her. The thought humbled her. Thank you, she whispered as they started down the mountain. For sharing this with me. For trusting me with it. Hiram's hand found hers as he guided the mule onto the trail. You're worth more than all the gold in these mountains, Chloe Stoltzfus. Don't ever doubt that. They rode down through the gathering snow, their hearts full of precious things that couldn't be measured in ounces or dollars. Trust, sacrifice, and the warm certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold as Hiram and Chloe loaded the wagon. The canvas sacks of gold samples clinked softly as Hiram tucked them beneath the seat, wrapping them carefully in an old blanket. The precious deed was folded inside his coat, close to his heart. Chloe's hands trembled as she tied her bonnet strings. What if it's not enough? Hiram helped her onto the wagon seat, his movements gentle despite his size. The Lord provides, he said simply. We'll trust in that. The journey down the mountain took nearly 3 hours. Ice had formed overnight on the rutted road, making the mule step cautiously. Neither spoke much, both lost in prayer and worry. As they approached Gunnison, smoke rose from chimneys into the crystal-clear morning air. The town was already bustling, miners heading to their claims, and merchants opening their shops. Hiram pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Larson's Mercantile. A small crowd had gathered on the boardwalk, drawn by the unusual sight of the mountain man and his Amish bride. Whispers followed them as they climbed down. Wait here, Hiram murmured to Chloe. She nodded, gripping the edge of the wagon for support as he retrieved the samples. The bell above the mercantile door jangled as Hiram ducked inside. Old Mr. Larson looked up from his ledger, adjusting his spectacles. Well now, Hiram Boone. Twice in 1 week. Must be some kind of record. Need these weighed proper, Hiram said, setting the canvas sacks on the counter. And witnessed too, if you don't mind. Larson raised an eyebrow, but pulled out his brass scale. The first few flakes sparked immediate interest. He examined them closely, holding them up to the morning light streaming through the window. This is real gold, Hiram. Good color, too. He began weighing carefully, recording the amounts. Where'd you come by this? My father's claim. Up past Thunder Ridge. Hiram produced the deed, unfolding it carefully. All legal and proper. The bell jangled again. Sheriff Dixon stepped in, followed by 2 hard-faced men in Eastern suits, the creditors. Chloe appeared in the doorway behind them, her face pale but determined. Well, well, drawled the taller creditor, McGraw. Heard tell there was some excitement at Larson's. Come to settle up, have you? That's right. Hiram's voice was quiet but firm. He nodded to Larson. How much do we have there? The merchant cleared his throat. Based on current prices, these samples alone are worth over $300. And if there's more where this came from. A murmur went through the growing crowd. McGraw's sneer faltered slightly. The deed's legitimate, Sheriff Dixon confirmed reluctantly, examining the document. Filed proper with the Territory Office back in '62. Hiram turned to face the creditors. My wife's debt was $250. These samples cover that, with interest. His large hand found Chloe's, squeezing gently. The debt is paid. In full. McGraw's face darkened. Now see here. The law's clear on this, Sheriff Dixon cut in, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Payment in full settles all claims. Even I can't argue with that. The gathered townsfolk pressed closer to the windows, straining to see. Mrs. Larson appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the glint of gold on her husband's scale. McGraw glared at Hiram and Chloe. Mighty convenient finding gold just when you needed it. The Lord provides, Chloe said softly, echoing Hiram's earlier words. Her voice grew stronger. And a debt paid is a debt settled. That's plain truth in any faith. Several of the townsfolk nodded. Even Sheriff Dixon cracked a small smile. Mr. Larson carefully wrapped the gold in paper, recording the transaction in his ledger. Would you like a receipt, mister? Boone. Yes, please, and witnesses to sign if folks are willing. 4 townspeople stepped forward immediately. The preacher, Mrs. Larson, the telegraph operator, and to everyone's surprise, Sheriff Dixon himself. They each signed the receipt, making it official. McGraw and his partner stormed out, leaving only the slam of the door behind them. The tension in the room eased like a long-held breath finally released. Chloe swayed slightly, overwhelmed. Hiram steadied her with a gentle hand. You all right? She nodded, tears threatening. Free, she whispered. Finally free. The afternoon sun was lowering when Mrs. Larson approached them as they prepared to leave. We're having supper at the boarding house tonight, she said warmly. Nothing fancy, just folks sharing a meal together. Would you two care to join us? Chloe hesitated, old insecurities rising. But Hiram smiled down at her, and she saw in his eyes what he'd been trying to tell her all along, that she belonged, just as she was. We'd be honored, she said. The boarding house dining room was warm and bright, filled with the smell of fresh bread and beef stew. Mrs. Larson had set extra places at the long table, right in the middle where everyone could talk easily. When Chloe sat down, the chair held firm. It was one of the sturdy ones, like Hiram had made her at home. The preacher said grace, and bowls were passed. Conversation flowed around them, talk of weather and crops, local news and small concerns. Gradually, Chloe felt herself relaxing. She even shared a story about her first attempts at baking in the mountain cabin, making everyone laugh. You've done well by her, Hiram, Mrs. Larson said later, as the plates were being cleared. Both of you seem right together, if you don't mind my saying so. Hiram ducked his head, shy but pleased. The Lord knew better than I did what I needed. What we both needed, Chloe corrected softly. She looked around the table at the faces that no longer held judgment or scorn, only neighborly warmth. For the first time since leaving her Amish community, she felt truly at home. The evening wrapped around them like a warm quilt as they prepared to head back to their mountain cabin. The town itself seemed different now, not a place of threat and shame, but simply another part of their world where they could come and go in peace. Mrs. Larson pressed a wrapped loaf of fresh bread into Chloe's hands as they said goodbye. You come back soon, hear? We'd love to learn some of those hymns you were humming earlier. Chloe hugged her, surprising them both. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. As Hiram helped her into the wagon, the last rays of sunset painted the snow-covered mountains in rose and gold. It was a sight that had frightened her once, all that wild isolation. Now it looked like promise, like hope and home and belonging. Dawn broke crisp and clear that Sunday morning, painting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. Chloe stood before the small mirror in their cabin, adjusting her plain black bonnet with trembling fingers. Behind her, Hiram straightened his collar, looking both proud and nervous in his best shirt. Ready? He asked softly. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Together they stepped out into the morning air, where their mule waited patiently at the hitching post. Hiram had polished the wagon yesterday until the wood gleamed and lined the seat with an extra quilt against the cold. The journey down the mountain seemed different today. Every bend in the trail held memories now, where they had first shared bread together, where he had helped her across the icy stream, where they had stopped to watch eagles soaring overhead. Chloe found herself humming one of her favorite hymns, Amazing Grace, and smiled when Hiram's deep voice joined in quietly. As they approached Gunnison, the church bell began to toll, its clear notes carrying across the valley. Other wagons and riders converged on the simple log building, and Chloe felt her heart speed up. But Hiram's steady presence beside her kept the old fears at bay. They pulled up to the church just as Preacher Ward stepped onto the porch. He smiled warmly, extending his hands in welcome. "Brother Hiram, Sister Chloe, we've been waiting for you." Inside, the church was already full. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The wooden pews had been polished, and someone had placed fresh pine boughs along the windowsills, filling the air with their sweet scent. Women nodded and smiled as the couple made their way to the front, while men touched their hat brims in respect. Preacher Ward raised his hands for silence as they reached the simple altar. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we are gathered here today to witness something special. The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing together those who need each other most. We've seen his hand at work these past weeks in our community." He turned to face Hiram and Chloe directly. "You two came together first by letter, then by choice, and now by God's grace. You faced trials together, supported each other, and shown us all what true partnership means." He smiled. "And today, before this congregation, we celebrate and bless your union properly." Chloe felt tears welling up as the preacher continued. She glanced at Hiram and found him looking at her with such tenderness that her heart nearly burst. "Hiram Boone," Preacher Ward said solemnly, "do you take this woman to be your lawful wedded wife, to love and cherish in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, as long as you both shall live?" Hiram's voice was clear and strong. "I do." "And do you, Chloe Stoltzfus, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband, to love and cherish, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Chloe whispered, then repeated more strongly, "I do." "Then by the authority vested in me, and before these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife." The preacher smiled broadly. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Mrs. Larson started the first hymn from her place at the small pump organ. "Amazing Grace," the very hymn they had sung on the way down. Other voices joined in, filling the church with harmony. Chloe's clear soprano rose with them, and Hiram's bass rumbled beneath, their voices blending perfectly. When the hymn ended, the congregation surged forward to congratulate them. Sheriff Dixon was among the first, shaking Hiram's hand firmly. "You're a lucky man, Boone," he said, then surprised everyone by adding, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for what was right sooner." The women clustered around Chloe, pressing packages into her arms. Mrs. Larson brought forward a huge basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Just a few things to start your proper married life," she said with a wink. "My bread recipe is in there too, though I hear yours is already better than mine." Young Mary Thompson shyly offered a carefully wrapped bundle. "I made you a tablecloth," she whispered. "Mama helped with the embroidery." More gifts appeared. Jars of preserved fruit, fresh eggs, a warm quilted shawl, even a fine china teacup from the mercantile owner's wife. Each gift represented not just the item itself, but acceptance into the community. Chloe's eyes spilled over as she thanked them all. Now, Mrs. Larson said, patting her hand. No tears today, dear. This is a celebration. The men had their own gifts for Hiram, a new axe handle, shooting supplies, winter gear. Sheriff Dixon contributed a fine leather holster, while the blacksmith presented him with a set of carefully crafted horseshoes for their mule. Preacher Ward's wife organized everyone to sing more hymns. Be thou my vision, great is thy faithfulness, and several others Chloe knew from her Amish days. The music swelled and soared in the small space, voices joining in four-part harmony that seemed to lift the very rafters. As the last notes faded, Preacher Ward raised his hands once more. Let us pray together for this couple as they begin their new life. The congregation bowed their heads as he asked for blessings on their union, their home, and their future together. When it was time to leave, the whole congregation followed them outside. The winter sun had warmed the air, making the snow glitter like diamonds. Their wagon had been loaded carefully with all the gifts, and someone had tied ribbons to the brake handle. Hiram helped Chloe up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Larson called out, Don't forget to come down for Christmas services. We'll need your voices in the choir. And bring more of those cookies, someone else added, making everyone laugh. They set off up the mountain road, accompanied by waves and calls of goodbye. Chloe leaned against Hiram's shoulder, her heart too full for words. The future stretched before them like the trail home, clear and bright and full of promise. Happy? Hiram asked softly as they rounded the first bend. Chloe squeezed his arm. More than I ever thought possible. She looked back at the town, now hidden behind the trees. I never expected to belong anywhere again, after everything. You belong right here, Hiram said simply. With me. The mule plodded steadily upward, the wagon creaking softly beneath its load of gifts. Chloe touched the basket of food, the carefully wrapped tablecloth, the warm shawl, each item a token of acceptance, of community restored. A jay called from a nearby pine, and far overhead, an eagle soared against the blue sky. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of snow and evergreens. Chloe began to hum another hymn, and Hiram's voice joined hers, their harmony floating out across the valley like a prayer of thanksgiving. Evening settled over the mountain as Hiram and Chloe arrived home from their wedding celebration. The afternoon sun had melted some of the snow, but now it was freezing again, forming delicate crystal patterns on the window panes. Drifts piled high against the cabin walls, glowing blue in the deepening twilight. Hiram helped Chloe down from the wagon, then carefully carried their wedding gifts inside while she lit the lamps. The cabin welcomed them with familiar creaks and settling sounds. Together, they unpacked the basket from Mrs. Larson, setting out fresh bread, preserved vegetables, and a pot of rich venison stew that still held its warmth. The hearth came alive quickly under Chloe's practiced touch. Soon, orange flames danced across the walls, filling their home with golden light and welcome heat. While she set their new tablecloth and arranged their supper, Hiram settled in his usual spot near the fire with his leather working tools. The harness needs mending before tomorrow, he explained, his big hands moving with surprising delicacy as he worked the awl through tough leather. The lamplight caught the fresh gold band on his finger, making it gleam. Chloe hummed softly as she moved about the cabin, adding small touches here and there. Mrs. Larson's basket on the shelf, Mary Thompson's tablecloth brightening their table, the fine china teacup displayed proudly on the mantel. Each gift found its place, transforming their home just as the town had transformed today to welcome them fully. When supper was ready, they sat together at their table, now graced with the embroidered cloth. Hiram bowed his head. Lord, we thank you for this food, for this day, and most of all for bringing us together. Amen. Amen, Chloe echoed softly. They ate quietly, comfortable in their shared silence. The stew was rich and warming, perfect for the cold night. Outside, wind whistled around the eaves, but inside all was snug and peaceful. After they finished, Hiram insisted on helping with the dishes despite Chloe's protests. "We're partners now," he reminded her, carefully drying each plate. "In everything." When the kitchen was tidy, Hiram added more wood to the fire while Chloe changed into her nightgown and wrapped the new shawl around her shoulders. The chair he had built for her stood waiting by the hearth, the first gift he had given her, made with such care for her comfort. Hiram settled into the chair first, then held out his hand. Chloe hesitated only a moment before sitting beside him, the chair accommodating them both perfectly. She laid her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and leather that always clung to him. In the distance, wolves began their nightly chorus, their haunting songs echoing off the mountainsides. But here in their cabin, all was warm and secure. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside their windows, stars began to peek through breaks in the clouds, diamond bright against the dark sky. "Hiram," Chloe whispered after a while, her voice thick with emotion. "That first day when I stepped down from the stagecoach, I truly believed I was too big for anyone to want." He tightened his arm around her shoulders but stayed silent, letting her speak. "I was so ashamed," she continued, "of my size, of the debts, of being cast out from my community." She lifted her head to look at him. "But you just said I was perfect. And today, watching you stand up to those creditors, seeing how the town accepted us." Her voice broke slightly. "I finally believe you meant it." Tears glimmered in Hiram's eyes as he gazed down at her. "You are perfect," he said softly, his deep voice gentle as he repeated those first words. "Perfect for me, perfect for this life." He pressed a tender kiss to her forehead. "Just right in every way that matters." Chloe's own tears spilled over as she settled back against him. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as they sat together, their hearts beating in quiet harmony. Outside, the wolves sang their wild songs to the night sky, but inside their cabin, peace reigned complete and undisturbed. The hymns from their wedding service seemed to linger in the air, a testament to their shared faith and the community that had finally embraced them both. As the evening deepened toward night, Chloe and Hiram remained together in the chair he had built with love, their future stretching bright and promising before them. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.